Hello movie Barfs, and welcome back to the channel. Magneto has always been one of the most memorable villains in both comic and cinema history. Whether it's his sterling leadership, magnetic charisma, no pun intended, or his strong convictions, there's something about his character that makes him a force to be reckoned with for the X-Men. Of all the on-screen appearances we've had, in my opinion, the best iteration has to be Michael Fassbender's version in X-Men First Class. It goes without saying that Ian McKellen did the role justice too, but X-Men First Class gave Eric Lehnsherr, aka Magneto, the most fleshed out character arc of all. No other film goes into such a deep dive into his psyche. The other movies have him as a side character or a plot device for an end battle, but X-Men First Class is Magneto's movie. Despite the title, the film isn't ultimately about the X-Men. He's the main character, front and center. It's Magneto who starts and ends the film, and it's Magneto who propels the film's plot forward. The movie is driven by Eric's mission to locate Sebastian Shaw, a German doctor who, decades earlier, killed his mother in an attempt to trigger his magnetic abilities. We see that Eric, being a Holocaust survivor, is no stranger to being ostracized and persecuted, something that sets him up for the human-mutant conflict later. He's a tortured soul that now has to face the loss of his mother and the indirect guilt that he's somehow responsible for not being able to move the coin. You can only imagine the feelings of loss, rejection, and abandonment he has to go through at such a tender age. He's seen the horrors of war and the atrocities that humanity is capable of when they discriminate against another race. Not only that, he feels an overwhelming sense of loneliness too, as he doesn't yet know he's not the only mutant out there. We get a glimpse into the darkness of his soul when the camera lingers on his blank eyes when he's torturing the bank manager and subsequently Emma Frost for information. We see a man who has crossed the line and is too far gone, past the point of redemption. His working relationship with Charles and the CIA was just a means to his ultimate objective for Shaw. So when he and Charles decide to train the mutants to take on Shaw, he says Shaw has his armies, so we need ours. A very telling choice of words that shows he views them as just pawns. When he discovers that there are other mutants like him as well, he knows how it'll eventually play out. History would repeat itself. Already scarred from the Holocaust, he expects humanity will eventually fear and hate them, just like how it was in his childhood. But his disdain for humanity extends beyond just this fear and hatred. At the core, he also feels his mission is sanctioned by the laws of nature and evolution, a theory that ironically was put forth by Charles Xavier, who strives for human-mutant coexistence. Eric believes that he and the other mutants are the superior life forms, and that the humans' oppression is a result of them resisting the natural end of their reign. When you combine this with his discriminated past and his emotional scars, it can only lead to one inevitable outcome, his hatred of humanity that he feels is justified. And we can't help but feel for his character. Given his life experiences, we know that we'd probably turn out like him if we were exposed to the same set of circumstances. All of us feel lonely and ostracized at times, although probably never to the extent that he does. We may not agree with his actions, but we get his motivations and why he acts the way he does. In the X-Men films, Magneto is a character that's usually motivated by loss. In X-Men First Class, it's the loss of his freedom and his mother. In X-Men Apocalypse, it's the loss of his wife and daughter. In X-Men Dark Phoenix, it's the loss of his friend Raven. But the Magneto in X-Men Apocalypse and Dark Phoenix wasn't as compelling as the one in First Class. Reason being, his conviction and conflict in these films were so easily resolved. In X-Men Apocalypse, all it took was an emotional monologue from Mystique to talk him out of destroying the world. In X-Men Dark Phoenix, it's even worse. He just abandons his vendetta against Jean after Scott tells him it's something Raven wouldn't have wanted. We see how poorly rooted his conviction is in those films, but in X-Men First Class, there's no stopping him in his mission. As he said, peace was never an option. Whether it's with Shaw or the humans, there is no outcome where he can coexist harmoniously with them. Without a doubt, we get the most driven Magneto here among all the X-Men films in this one. Not even Charles could dissuade him despite how close they were. Whether it's discouraging him from killing Shaw or persuading him to give humanity a chance, one of the highlights of their friendship was Charles's efforts to turn him back from the destructive path he's on. Charles wants him to make the journey to be the better man in terms of emotional temperance, but Eric completely dismisses the notion. In his mind, he already is the better man in terms of evolution. And as it turns out at the end, Eric was right that the humans would turn on them. He was right not just in First Class, but in Days of Future Past, and even in Logan too. If we're tallying score between Charles and Eric, Eric wins by a landslide. After saving the humans from the threat of World War III, they decide to fire their missiles on them. There's a brief moment where we see a look of pride on Charles's face when Eric stops the missiles, showing how proud he is of how far he's come. Charles then argues with Eric over launching the missiles back, but unfortunately his choice of words proved to have the opposite effect. By saying that they were just following orders, it triggered all the rage and helplessness he felt as a child. You could tell Eric hadn't made up his mind until Charles said that. Until then, he looked like he was deciding over whether to kill them or not. But as soon as he heard that excuse again, the excuse he heard from evil men who killed millions of his people, his mind was made up. Earlier on in the bar scene with the two Nazis, we see how hiding behind the orders of a superior was no excuse for Eric. No worse words could have been spoken by Charles at that moment. It was just pouring more fuel into the fire. Very poor choice of words, as the Joker would say. Charles wasn't trying to save the people inside the ships. He was trying to save Eric from becoming a monster. But at that point, Eric no longer existed. Only Magneto remained. In his final confrontation with Shaw, him donning the helmet was symbolic of him drowning out the voice of Charles, a rejection of his philosophy of living peaceably. Charles, on the other hand, is in a dilemma. He doesn't want Eric to kill Shaw, but at the same time, he knows Eric will die if he releases him. This scene is so incredibly complex. Imagine the agony, desperation, despair, satisfaction of all three in this scene. Eric realizes that while he hated Shaw's actions, they equipped him to survive in a world that would turn against him. He completes the very first task Shaw gave him, and as he moves the coin through Shaw's head, Charles experiences the excruciating pain of not only the act itself, but the agony of losing his friend, watching him become the antithesis of everything he worked against. At that moment, Charles and Eric's friendship had run its course. Best friends and equals that were brought up in polar opposite fashions. One survived the Holocaust and watched his whole family butchered in front of him. The other was raised alone in a lavish estate. While they shared the same goal of helping mutants, their differences in approach were irreconcilable. Charles was the idealist, Eric the realist. But as much as Eric disagreed with Charles's ideology, it says a lot that he was willing to momentarily let go of his rage the moment he was shot. It always gives me chills when Eric says, "I don't want to hurt you, don't make me," because it just adds so much more to their separation later. It would have been even better if his fallout with Charles was spread out over 2 films at least, and covering a time span of a few movie decades so that we can have a more dramatic parting of ways, but I'll take what we got. Well, since I said that X-Men First Class has the best version of Magneto, I suppose I'd be remiss if I didn't cover the other iterations too. Magneto in the first X-Men movie was a great start. His motivation and disdain for humanity was clear to us as the audience. In fact, it provided the same opening scene which was recreated in First Class. If I were to pick one scene to best summarize his motives, it would be his monologue to Rogue on the irony of the Statue of Liberty, on how there is no peace, no tolerance, not here or anywhere else. But there's one thing I didn't really like about how he was written in the first film. While we understand that he's prejudiced against humans, he's a coward at the end, as pointed out by Wolverine. He doesn't use the machine himself, but hides behind Rogue to let her die instead of him. In X-Men 2, he was generally okay, but he had a much smaller role due to Stryker taking the lead antagonist role. In X-Men The Last Stand, we get the final conclusion of his character arc. His best line was that his single greatest regret was that Charles had to die for his dream to live. We see this all-out assault on humanity, but my gripe with his character is how he just abandons Mystique right after she sacrifices herself to save him. At that point, it seemed heartless, and not to mention ungrateful of him, to just leave behind his lifelong companion when he owes his life to her. As for Days of Future Past, it's a pretty good portrayal too, especially with his argument with Charles on the plane on who abandoned who. But overall, X-Men First Class gives the Master of Magnetism the best character arc. We get the most comprehensive look behind his psyche, why he thinks he's on the right side, and why humans and mutants can never live peaceably. We see the breakdown of his friendship with Charles and the start of their rivalry, where they reach a fork in the road and have to part ways due to incompatible ideologies. When you see the events of his life and the horrors he faced from his perspective, you can't help but understand why trusting humans is an impossible task for him. And how could he, when he's seen the absolute worst humanity is capable of? He's not dangerous because he can control metal. He's a threat because there is some truth in his point of view, and his followers can see it. As a child, he was powerless to help his people in the Holocaust. Now, as a mutant, he's determined to use his power to do what he couldn't do as a child. If any of you are Magneto fans and wish he had a standalone movie, look no further than X-Men First Class.